A billionaire rescues a black girl from the streets, but their matching scars hint at a hidden truth. What shocking revelation about their shared past will come to light? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the brick walls of Lower Manhattan as Ethan Malone emerged from the glass doors of Malone Industries headquarters. His tailored suit and confident stride marked him as someone accustomed to moving in privileged circles, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the weight of his responsibilities. The board meeting had dragged on for hours, filled with demands and expectations that came with being the heir to a billion-dollar empire. As he walked down the street, seeking a moment of peace before his next appointment, an explosion of color caught his eye. In a small alley between two buildings, a woman worked intently on a large mural. Her movements were precise and purposeful, each stroke of paint adding depth to an image that seemed to pulse with raw emotion. The mural depicted a cityscape being torn apart and rebuilt, with threads of gold weaving through the destruction like veins of hope. Ethan found himself slowing down, then stopping completely. The artist worked with such intensity that she hadn't noticed him watching. Her clothes were worn but clean, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid. There was something compelling about the way she approached her work, an urgency that spoke of deeper meaning behind each brushstroke. He watched as she stepped back from the wall, tilting her head to study her work. Without thinking, he spoke. "The way you've captured the light breaking through the buildings, it's extraordinary." The woman startled slightly, turning to face him. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, clearly used to being on guard. "This is a legal wall," she said firmly. "I have permission to paint here." "I wasn't questioning that," Ethan replied, raising his hands slightly. "I'm just impressed by your work." "I'm Ethan." He deliberately left off his last name, not wanting the weight of it to change the dynamic of their interaction. The artist studied him for a moment longer before relaxing slightly. "Maya," she offered. "Maya Johnson." Looking at her work more closely, Ethan noticed how the golden threads in the mural seemed to shimmer with an almost painful brightness against the darker elements. There's so much emotion in this piece. The contrast between light and shadow, it feels like you're telling a story about survival. Maya's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features. "Most people just see pretty colors," she said, her voice carrying a hint of approval at his observation. "Would you let me buy you a coffee?" The words came out before Ethan could consider them fully. "There's a place around the corner that makes decent espresso. I'd love to hear more about your work." Maya hesitated, looking between her unfinished mural and Ethan. He could see her weighing the offer, likely trying to determine if there were strings attached. Finally, she nodded. "Let me pack up my supplies first." Over coffee, Maya shared carefully edited pieces of her story. She spoke about living on the streets for a while, about finding her voice through art, about the community centers that had given her space to work. But Ethan noticed what she didn't say. There were no mentions of family, no childhood memories, no explanation for how she'd ended up on the streets in the first place. "Art saved me," she said simply, warming her hands around her coffee cup. "When everything else was chaos, I could still create something beautiful, something that mattered." Ethan found himself drawn to the quiet strength in her voice, the resilience that showed through despite her obvious caution. He shared some of his own story, too, the pressure of expectations, the loneliness of being viewed as nothing more than his family's legacy. It was more than he'd intended to reveal, but something about Maya made him want to be honest. As their conversation drew to a close, Maya reached for her bag. The sleeve of her jacket rode up slightly, and Ethan caught a glimpse of a scar on her forearm. The sight of it sent an unexpected jolt through him. The mark was distinctive, a curved line with a smaller slash crossing it, almost like a broken infinity symbol. His hand unconsciously moved to his own arm, where an identical scar lay hidden beneath his expensive suit. The coincidence was unsettling enough that for a moment, he lost track of their conversation. By the time he recovered his composure, Maya was already standing to leave. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, shouldering her bag of supplies. "And for seeing more than just pretty colors." Ethan watched her walk away, his mind racing with questions he hadn't thought to ask. The scar on his arm seemed to burn with newfound significance, a mark he'd carried for so long he'd almost forgotten its presence. Now it felt like a sign, pointing towards something he couldn't yet understand but suddenly needed to uncover. The discovery of Maya's scar haunted Ethan for days after their encounter. In his home office, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that defined his life, he found himself pulling out old family albums and documents. The scar on his arm had always been explained away as a childhood accident, but now he questioned everything he thought he knew about his past. His investigation led him to his grandmother's house, a stately mansion in the Upper East Side that held generations of Malone family history. Eleanor Malone, now in her 80s, maintained the sharp wit and commanding presence that had helped build the family empire. When Ethan arrived unannounced, she was in her study, surrounded by photographs and papers from the family's archives. "Grandmother," Ethan began, carefully choosing his words, "I need to ask you about something from my childhood." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the scar. "How did I really get this?" Eleanor's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, a pause before she spoke. "We've discussed this before, dear. You fell from your bicycle when you were 5. That's not the whole truth, is it?" Ethan pressed, noting how his grandmother's fingers tightened around her teacup. "I met someone with an identical scar. Exactly identical. That's not a coincidence." Eleanor set down her cup with deliberate care. "You've always been too curious for your own good, Ethan. Some things are better left in the past." Meanwhile, across the city, Maya stood before a blank canvas in her small studio apartment. The space was modest but filled with light, the walls covered in half-finished paintings and sketches. Her encounter with Ethan had stirred something in her, memories and emotions she usually kept locked away. She began to paint, her brushstrokes aggressive and certain. The canvas filled with dark blues and deep purples, shot through with streaks of brilliant white. In the center, almost unconsciously, she began to paint 2 figures, their arms marked with identical scars, reaching toward each other across a divide of shadow and light. Hours passed as Maya worked, losing herself in the process. The painting took shape, becoming something more than she'd intended, a representation of not just her meeting with Ethan, but of something deeper, something that felt like destiny and danger intertwined. A week after their first meeting, Ethan returned to the alley where he'd first seen Maya. She was there again, working on a new mural, this time incorporating metallic paints that caught the light like captured stars. Without a word, he set down a large art supply case beside her. Maya turned, recognition and wariness warring in her expression. "What's this?" "Professional-grade paints and brushes," Ethan said simple. "Why? I saw how you made that gold paint stretch. You shouldn't have to compromise on materials." Maya's hand hovered over the case, not quite touching it. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's investment in talent." Ethan paused, watching her internal struggle. "Besides, I have some questions I'd like to ask you." This time, their conversation moved beyond surface pleasantries. Maya spoke about her life on the streets, about the community centers that had given her space to work, about the way art had become her lifeline. But when Ethan tried to ask about her family, about her childhood, she withdrew into herself. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," she said, echoing Eleanor's words without knowing it. "Sometimes the past should stay buried." Ethan noticed how she unconsciously rubbed her scarred arm as she spoke, the same way he often did when troubled. The gesture strengthened his conviction that their meeting wasn't random, that some thread of fate or history tied them together. "The past has a way of surfacing," he said quietly, "whether we want it to or not." Maya looked at him sharply, something like recognition flickering in her eyes. "What do you know about it?" "Not enough," Ethan admitted. "But I'm starting to think our stories might be connected in ways neither of us understands." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken questions. Maya returned to her mural, but her strokes had lost their earlier confidence. Ethan watched her work, noting how she incorporated elements of shadow and light, much like the painting he'd first seen her create. As the day drew to a close, Maya finally spoke again. "Sometimes I dream about how I got this scar," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when I wake up, the memories slip away like smoke." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "I have the same dreams," he admitted. The coincidence seemed too precise to be random, too specific to be chance. But neither of them was ready to explore what that might mean. The gallery opening was Ethan's idea. He'd seen Maya's work evolving over the past few weeks, becoming more complex and emotionally charged. Through his connections, he arranged for her pieces to be displayed at the prestigious Hamilton Gallery in Chelsea, known for launching emerging artists' careers. On opening night, Maya stood uncomfortably in a borrowed dress, watching as New York's elite circulated through the space. Her paintings lined the walls, large, striking canvases that told stories of struggle and resilience. The centerpiece was the painting she'd created after meeting Ethan, the two scarred figures reaching across the divide. She titled it simply Connection. Ethan moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but he noticed the subtle ways people reacted to Maya. The raised eyebrows when they learned she'd been homeless, the slight stepping back when she mentioned her background in street art. The microaggressions were subtle but constant, like paper cuts that accumulated throughout the evening. "Did you hear?" One woman whispered loudly to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice enough. She actually lived on the streets. "I suppose that's what makes her work so raw." The word dripped with condescension. Maya's shoulders tensed, but she continued explaining her work to an interested collector. Ethan watched her maintain her composure, impressed by her strength, but angry at the underlying prejudice she faced. He moved closer, placing himself protectively near her, using his presence to deflect some of the more obvious snubs. Later, as the crowd thinned, Maya found a quiet moment in front of her centerpiece painting. "They don't see me," she said quietly when Ethan approached. "They see a story they can tell at dinner parties." The homeless girl made good. Their own personal redemption narrative. "Your work speaks for itself," Ethan replied. "The sales tonight prove that." Maya turned to face him, her expression serious. "I need to tell you something about my grandmother." She led him to a secluded corner of the gallery. She was accused of stealing from the family she worked for. A wealthy family, old money. She always maintained her innocence, but no one believed her. It destroyed our family's reputation, pushed us into poverty. Ethan felt a creeping sense of dread. "When did this happen?" 25 years ago, Maya answered. "The family's name was Malone." Ethan finished, his voice barely audible. The family was Malone. The silence between them grew thick with implication. Maya stepped back, studying his face with new understanding. "You knew." "I just found out through my research," Ethan admitted. "My grandmother, she's been evasive about the past. But I never connected it to you until now." Maya's expression hardened. "So all of this, the gallery, the art supplies, the coffee dates, was it just guilt? Trying to make amends for your family's sins?" "No," Ethan protested. "I didn't know when we met. I still don't know the whole story. But these scars, our connection, it can't be coincidence." "Our connection?" Maya laughed bitterly. "Your family destroyed mine. Your grandmother accused mine of theft, had her arrested, made it impossible for her to find work again. Do you know what that did to us? How we lived after that?" "I want to understand," Ethan said. "I want to know the truth." "The truth?" Maya's voice shook with emotion. "The truth is that your family's wealth is built on destroying people like me. People who can't fight back. People who don't have the power to defend themselves." "I'm not my family," Ethan argued, but Maya cut him off. "Aren't you? You swoop in with your money and connections, thinking you can fix everything. Did you ever consider that I didn't need fixing? That maybe your help just reinforces the same power dynamic that ruined my grandmother's life?" The conversation was interrupted by the gallery owner announcing closing time. Maya gathered her things quickly, avoiding Ethan's gaze. Just before she left, she turned back. "The worst part is, I started to believe in you. In us. Whatever this connection is between us, these scars, these dreams, I thought it meant something. But maybe it's just another reminder of how our families are bound together by pain. Ethan watched her leave, the weight of their family's history pressing down on him like a physical force. The scars on their arms seemed to burn with renewed significance, not just marks of a shared past, but symbols of a divide that might be impossible to bridge. The Malone family estate sprawled across 2 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, its manicured lawns and classical architecture representing generations of wealth and privilege. Ethan brought Maya here on a sunny Sunday afternoon, convinced that confronting their shared history head-on was the only way forward. As they drove through the iron gates, he noticed Maya's hands tightening in her lap. The family had gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner, though Ethan had informed them he was bringing a guest. His mother, Victoria Malone, stood at the entrance, her pearl necklace and perfectly styled hair creating an image of refined elegance. His father, Richard, waited beside her, his usual stern expression firmly in place. "Mother, father," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his internal tension. "This is Maya Johnson. She's an artist I've been working with." The deliberate omission of their deeper connection hung in the air. Victoria's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened as she took in Maya's appearance. Despite wearing her best clothes, Maya couldn't hide her artistic nature. Paint stains under her fingernails, a small tattoo visible on her wrist, her style more bohemian than boutique. "How interesting," Victoria said, the pause before interesting speaking volumes. The dinner that followed was an exercise in subtle warfare. Victoria peppered Maya with questions that seemed innocent but carried barbs. "And where did you study art, dear?" Knowing full well that formal education hadn't been an option for Maya. "Which galleries typically represent your work?" Fully aware that Ethan had arranged Maya's first gallery showing. Richard Malone maintained his silence throughout most of the meal, but his disapproving glances spoke clearly enough. The tension peaked when Victoria brought up family history. "The Malones have been patrons of the arts for generations," she said, swirling her wine. "Though we typically support more established artists, those with proper training and background." Maya set down her fork, her composure cracking slightly. Sometimes the most authentic art comes from living through experiences rather than studying them in a classroom. Victoria's smile turned sharp. "Yes, I suppose living on the streets would provide quite the unique perspective." "Mother," Ethan interrupted, his voice carrying a warning. "What, darling? I'm merely making conversation." Victoria turned back to Maya. "Tell me, dear, what does your family think of your career choice?" The question hit its mark. Maya's face paled slightly, and Ethan could see her struggling to maintain her composure. "My family experienced some hardships," she said carefully. "Not everyone has the luxury of generational wealth." The implication wasn't lost on Victoria, whose smile finally faltered. An uncomfortable silence descended over the table, broken only by the soft clink of silverware against fine china. Later that evening, Maya stood in the mansion's garden, trying to collect herself. Ethan found her there, staring at a fountain that probably cost more than she'd ever earned in her life. "I shouldn't have come," she said without turning around. "This was a mistake." "Maya, I'm sorry about my mother's behavior. Don't." She cut him off. "Don't apologize for them. This is who they are, who you are. This world." She gestured at the mansion, the grounds, the wealth surrounding them. "It's not mine. It never will be." "It doesn't have to define us," Ethan argued, but even as he said it, he felt the weight of his family name, the expectations and prejudices that came with it. "Doesn't it?" Maya finally turned to face him. "Your mother looks at me and sees someone beneath her. Someone who doesn't belong in her world. And maybe she's right. I'm not my mother. I don't see you that way. But you're still trying to fix me, aren't you?" Maya's voice was tired. "The art supplies, the gallery showing, bringing me here, you're trying to elevate me to your level, make me acceptable to your world. But what if I don't want to be acceptable to them?" Ethan felt the truth in her words hit him like a physical blow. In his desire to help, had he been unconsciously trying to reshape her into someone his family would accept? The realization made him question everything about their relationship. He started, then stopped, struggling to find the right words. I want to bridge this gap between us. Some gaps aren't meant to be bridged, Maya replied softly. Sometimes they're there to show us where we really belong. The evening ended with Maya calling a rideshare, refusing Ethan's offer to drive her home. As he watched her leave, he realized that their shared scars might be more than just physical marks. They might be warnings about the pain of trying to unite two worlds that had been divided for generations. 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner at the Malone estate, Maya channeled her turmoil into a new art exhibition. She rented a small gallery space in Brooklyn, far from the prestigious Chelsea art scene where Ethan had first showcased her work. The space was raw, industrial, with exposed brick walls and visible pipes, a deliberate contrast to the polished Hamilton gallery. Maya spent days arranging her newest pieces, each painting reflecting the complex emotions of recent events. The centerpiece was a massive triptych. The first panel showed two hands reaching toward each other, marked with identical scars. The second depicted those same hands separated by a wall of golden coins and silver spoons. The third panel showed the hands turned away from each other, the scars fading into a backdrop of shadows. Ethan received the invitation to the opening via email, a simple digital flyer with the exhibition title, Inherited Wounds. He noticed she'd listed herself as just Maya, dropping her last name entirely, as if rejecting even that part of her identity. On opening night, the gallery filled with a different crowd than her Chelsea debut. Street artists, community activists, people who knew Maya from her days painting murals, they came to support one of their own. Ethan felt conspicuous in his tailored suit, a fish out of water in this authentic, unpretentious space. Maya was in her element, dressed in paint-splattered jeans and a vintage t-shirt, moving through the crowd with genuine warmth. She stopped short when she saw Ethan, her expression guarded, but before either could speak, a woman approached Maya with familiar enthusiasm. "Maya Johnson, you talented soul." The woman embraced Maya tightly. "These pieces are incredible. They remind me of your grandmother's work." Maya stiffened slightly. "Sarah, I didn't know you were coming." Sarah, a woman in her 60s with silver dreadlocks and artist's hands, continued as if she hadn't noticed the tension. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Though she always did say the Malones would never understand true art, too caught up in their money to see real beauty. Ethan, standing close enough to overhear, saw Maya's face pale. Sarah followed Maya's glance, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. "Well, speak of the devil. A Malone here in our midst. Come to see how the other half lives." "Sarah, please," Maya began, but Sarah was on a roll. "Did you know your grandmother ruined Agnes Johnson's life?" Sarah directed her words at Ethan, her voice carrying across the gallery. "Accused her of stealing a necklace that probably costs less than what you're wearing right now. Agnes had worked for your family for 15 years. 15 years. And one accusation from Eleanor Malone was all it took to destroy her reputation." The gallery had grown quiet, attention focused on their corner. Ethan maintained his composure, though his heart raced. "I'm here to support Maya's work," he said quietly. "Support?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "The Malones only know how to take, not support. Agnes died believing no one would ever know the truth about what happened that day." Maya stepped between them, her voice tight with emotion. "This isn't the place, Sarah." "Then where is the place?" Sarah demanded. "In their mansion, where they can look down on us. In their fancy galleries, where they can pretend to be patrons of the arts while stepping on real artists." Ethan watched Maya throughout this exchange, seeing how she struggled between loyalty to her community and her feelings for him. He realized that by trying to protect her from pain, he'd actually been diminishing her strength, treating her like someone who needed saving rather than an equal partner in uncovering the truth. "Maya," he said softly, "I should go." She met his eyes, and for a moment, he saw all the complexity of their situation reflected there. The attraction, the shared mystery of their scars, the weight of their family's history, and the growing chasm between their worlds. "Maybe you should," she agreed, and the words carried the weight of more than just this moment. As Ethan left the gallery, he heard Sarah's voice fade behind him. Your grandmother always said that necklace would bring truth to light someday. Guess she was right about that, at least. The mention of the necklace stayed with him, adding another piece to the puzzle of their shared past. But for now, he understood that his presence in Maya's world was causing more harm than good, forcing her to choose between her community and their connection. Maya spent the week after the gallery opening in an intense creative period, barely sleeping as she worked on a single massive canvas in her studio apartment. The painting took shape slowly, becoming a complex exploration of duality. On one side, she depicted the glittering towers of Manhattan, all gold leaf and sharp angles. On the other, she painted the reality of city streets, with authentic texture created by mixing actual dirt and grit into the paint. In the center, where the two worlds collided, she painted a delicate, spiraling pattern of scars, connecting yet dividing the composition. Each brush stroke carried the weight of her internal conflict. The attraction she felt toward Ethan warred with her loyalty to her community and her grandmother's memory. The yearning to understand their connection battled against the fear of what that understanding might reveal. She worked through sunrise and sunset, letting the paint express what she couldn't say in words. Across the city, Ethan initiated his own exploration of truth. In his family's archives, he discovered photographs from the time his grandmother had accused Maya's grandmother of theft. One image caught his attention: Eleanor Malone at a charity gala, wearing an ornate necklace with a distinctive pendant. It was the same necklace that had allegedly been stolen, yet the photograph was dated 3 months after the accusation. The discovery sent Ethan into a deep dive through financial records, newspaper clippings, and family correspondence. He noticed discrepancies in the timeline, contradictions in statements, and most tellingly, a series of large payments made to an offshore account immediately after Agnes Johnson's arrest. When he finally gathered enough courage to visit Maya's latest exhibition at a small community center, he found himself standing before her new painting for a long time. The way she had depicted their two worlds, not meeting, not blending, but somehow still connected through those spiral patterns of scars, spoke to him on a visceral level. It's called inherited truth. Maya's voice came from behind him. She looked tired but resolute, paint still staining her fingers. I couldn't sleep until I finished it. The scars in the middle. Ethan gestured. They're like ours. They're everything that connects us and divides us, Maya explained, moving to stand beside him. Family history, social class, privilege, pain, all of it wrapped up in these marks we both carry. Ethan turned to face her directly. I found something in my family's records. The necklace my grandmother accused your grandmother of stealing. She was wearing it months after the alleged theft. Maya's breath caught. What are you saying? I think it was never about the necklace, Ethan said quietly. I think it was about something else, something bigger that my family wanted to hide. The theft accusation was just a convenient way to discredit someone who might have known too much. Maya wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her seem suddenly vulnerable. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve the truth, Ethan replied. And because I'm starting to think these scars we share aren't a coincidence. They're a message from the past, trying to right a wrong that was done to both our families. The weight of this revelation hung between them, heavy with implication. Maya studied her painting, then looked back at Ethan. If you're right, uncovering the truth could destroy your family's reputation. Maybe it needs to be destroyed, Ethan said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Maybe some things are more important than protecting a legacy built on lies. Maya reached out hesitantly, her fingers hovering over the scar on his arm without touching it. These marks we share, what do you think they really mean? I think they're a reminder that the past isn't finest. Head with us, Ethan replied. And maybe they're telling us that healing can only begin with truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. Ethan stood in his grandmother's study, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the antique furniture. Eleanor Malone sat in her usual chair, but her usual composure had cracked after Ethan placed the photograph of her wearing the allegedly stolen necklace on her desk. You want to explain this? Ethan kept his voice steady, though his heart raced. The date on this photo is 3 months after you accused Agnes Johnson of stealing this exact necklace. The same necklace that supposedly was never recovered. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the photograph. You've been digging into things that don't concern you. They do concern me, Ethan insisted, rolling up his sleeve to reveal his scar. This mark I've carried my whole life. Maya Johnson has the exact same one. That's not a coincidence, grandmother. Nothing about this is coincidence. Eleanor's face paled at the mention of Maya's name. You've been seeing that girl? That girl is an artist who grew up in poverty because you destroyed her grandmother's reputation. Ethan leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. I found the financial records too. Large payments to offshore accounts right after Agnes's arrest. You weren't protecting the family's reputation. You were covering something up. The older woman stood abruptly, moving to the window. It was more complicated than you could understand. Your grandfather. He had made some questionable decisions. The company was at risk. Agnes knew things, had seen documents she shouldn't have. So, you framed her for theft. The disgust in Ethan's voice was palpable. Destroyed an innocent woman's life to protect the family fortune? To protect you. Eleanor turned back, her eyes fierce. Everything I did was to ensure you would have a future, a legacy untainted by scandal. Your grandfather's dealings with certain organizations, if they had come to light, it would have ruined everything. Ethan felt the weight of generations of privilege and corruption pressing down on him. And our scars? What do they have to do with all this? Eleanor sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her years. That's the one thing I never understood. The marks appeared on both of you the same night everything happened. We found you in the nursery, crying, with that strange scar. And when I heard that Agnes's granddaughter had the same mark, she shook her head. Some things defy explanation. Across the city, Maya sat in her studio, staring at her latest work, a canvas covered in spiraling patterns that mimicked their shared scar. The revelation about the necklace had shaken her deeply, confirming suspicions her grandmother had taken to her grave. When her phone rang and she saw Ethan's name, she answered with trepidation. My grandmother confessed, Ethan said without preamble. Your grandmother was innocent. She knew about some illegal dealings my grandfather was involved in, and they needed to discredit her before she could expose them. Maya closed her eyes, years of family pain crystallizing into this moment of truth. My grandmother died thinking no one would ever believe her. There's more, Ethan continued. The night it all happened, when they confronted your grandmother, that's when we both got these scars. We were just children, but somehow. We were marked by it, Maya finished. As if the universe itself wanted to make sure the truth would come out someday. The silence between them felt heavy with possibility and fear. What do we do now? Maya finally asked. That depends, Ethan replied. Are you willing to help me expose everything? It won't be easy. My family will fight back with everything they have. Maya looked at her painting, at the intricate patterns that had haunted both their lives. These scars connected us for a reason, she said slowly. Maybe we owe it to our younger selves to see this through. But even as they made their decision, forces were already moving against them. Eleanor's confession had been overheard by the house staff, and within hours, the information had reached Victoria Malone. Ethan's mother had always been the true power behind the family's current wealth, and she had no intention of letting old secrets destroy everything she'd built. The weight of their discovery drove Maya and Ethan apart temporarily, each needing space to process what they'd learned and decide their next steps. Maya retreated to her art studio, channeling her emotions into a series of paintings that explored themes of independence and self-discovery. Each canvas represented a step in her journey from victim to survivor to advocate for truth. During this period of separation, Maya finally understood that her identity couldn't be defined solely by her relationship with Ethan or their shared trauma. Her art began to evolve, moving beyond the pain of the past to explore possibilities for the future. She started teaching art classes at the same community center that had once given her shelter, helping other young people find their voice through creativity. Meanwhile, Ethan underwent his own transformation. The revelation about his family's corruption forced him to confront his role in perpetuating systems of privilege. He resigned from his position at Malone Industries, causing a minor scandal in the business world. But instead of trying to fix Maya's life or save her from her circumstances, he began focusing on using his resources to support systemic change. Their paths crossed again at a community art initiative Maya had organized. Ethan attended not as a wealthy patron, but as someone genuinely interested in supporting grassroots artistic expression. He found Maya teaching a group of teenagers how to create murals that told their own stories. "You look different," Maya observed when she noticed him watching the class. "I feel different," Ethan replied. "I'm not trying to be anyone's savior anymore. I'm just trying to be useful." Maya nodded, understanding the profound shift this represented. "I've been thinking about justice," she said. "Not just for my grandmother, but for everyone who's been silenced by power and privilege." "That's why I'm here," Ethan said. "I want to help expose the truth, but I understand now that it has to be on your terms, not mine. You're not a charity case or a cause. You're a partner in this fight." The word partner hung between them, carrying new weight and meaning. Maya considered it carefully before responding. "Your mother won't make this easy. She's already trying to discredit my work in the art world." "I know," Ethan acknowledged, "but maybe that's not what matters anymore. Your real work, what you're doing here with these kids, that's what's important. And exposing the truth about our family's past could help prevent history from repeating itself." Maya touched her scar unconsciously, a gesture Ethan mirrored without thinking. "These marks connected us for a reason," she said slowly. "But maybe not in the way we first thought. Maybe they're not about romance or destiny. Maybe they're about justice." Their conversation was interrupted by one of Maya's students asking for help with a technique. As she walked away, Ethan reflected on how their relationship had evolved. The initial attraction and mystery had transformed into something more meaningful, a shared commitment to truth and change. Later that evening, they sat in Maya's studio, surrounded by her newest works. The paintings no longer focused on their scars or their family's conflict. Instead, they depicted scenes of transformation and resilience, each canvas telling a story of hope emerging from hardship. "I want to help you expose the truth," Ethan said, "but not as your protector or savior, as your ally." Maya studied him for a moment before nodding. "An ally," she repeated, testing the word. "I think I can work with that." Together, they began planning how to bring the full story to light, knowing that the path ahead would be challenging but necessary. Their scars had brought them together, but their shared commitment to justice would keep them connected as they faced whatever consequences might come. As Maya and Ethan delved deeper into their family's history, they discovered a trove of documents in the Malone family's private archive that painted a disturbing picture. Working late one night in Ethan's apartment, they spread the papers across his dining room table, piecing together a complex web of deception that went far beyond a single stolen necklace. The documents revealed that Ethan's grandfather had been involved in significant financial fraud during the 1990s, using the family's legitimate business as a front for money laundering. Agnes Johnson, Maya's grandmother, had worked as a housekeeper but also helped manage some of the household accounts. She had noticed discrepancies in the books and begun keeping detailed records of suspicious transactions. One particular document stood out, a handwritten letter from Agnes to Eleanor Malone, dated just days before the theft accusation. In it, Agnes expressed her concerns about the irregularities she'd found and her moral obligation to report them. The letter never reached its intended recipient. Instead, it had been intercepted by Victoria Malone, who had just married into the family at the time. "Your mother orchestrated all of it," Maya said quietly, examining the letter. "She saw my grandmother as a threat to her new position in the family." Ethan nodded grimly. She was ambitious, newly married, and determined to protect the family's wealth at any cost. The necklace accusation wasn't just about silencing your grandmother, it was Victoria's way of proving her loyalty to the Malones. As they continued their research, they began receiving anonymous warnings. First, Maya's art studio was broken into, though nothing was stolen, a clear intimidation tactic. Then Ethan's personal email was hacked, with threatening messages sent to his business contacts. The pressure was mounting, but it only convinced them they were on the right track. Their investigation led them to Thomas Chen, a former accountant for Malone Industries who had resigned abruptly during the same period. They found him living quietly in Queens, initially reluctant to speak about the past. But when they showed him their matching scars, his resistance crumbled. "I was there that night," Thomas revealed, his hands shaking as he poured tea in his small kitchen. "The night you both got those marks." Agnes had come to the house with evidence of the fraud, thinking she could appeal to Eleanor's conscience. Victoria intercepted her. There was a confrontation in the nursery, where young Ethan was sleeping. Maya was there too. Agnes had brought her along because she couldn't find a sitter. Thomas paused, struggling with the memory. Something strange happened during the argument. The necklace, the one they later accused Agnes of stealing, it was lying on the dresser. When Victoria threatened to destroy Agnes's evidence, the necklace seemed to glow. There was a flash of light, and both children started crying. When the chaos settled, you both had those identical marks. The revelation stunned them into silence. Maya touched her scar instinctively, feeling its familiar pattern beneath her fingers. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Victoria made sure I understood the consequences of speaking out. Thomas replied bitterly. "But I've kept records of everything. Meeting you both, seeing those scars, maybe it's finally time for the truth to come out." But even as Thomas handed over his documentation, other forces were moving against them. Victoria Malone had learned of their meeting through her extensive network of connections. She understood that her carefully constructed world was in danger of collapse, and she wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. That evening, as Maya and Ethan left Thomas's apartment with their newfound evidence, they noticed a black car following them. The stakes had suddenly become very real. They weren't just uncovering old family secrets anymore. They were threatening the foundations of current power structures that would do anything to stay hidden. "We need to be careful," Ethan warned, guiding Maya through a series of side streets to lose their tail. "My mother won't just try to discredit us now. She'll do whatever it takes to keep this buried." Maya clutched the folder of documents closer. "Then we need to make sure the truth is too big to bury. We need to make it impossible to silence us." They shared a look of determination, understanding that they had crossed a point of no return. Their scars had brought them together, but courage would see them through what was coming next. The confrontation unfolded in the grand library of the Malone mansion, where generations of family portraits watched in silent judgment. Victoria Malone stood behind her husband's imposing desk, facing her son and Maya with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to wielding power. The evidence they'd gathered lay spread across the mahogany surface: financial records, Thomas Chen's testimony, and the damning letter from Agnes Johnson. "Did you really think you could threaten everything I've built?" Victoria's voice carried the sharp edge of controlled fury. "I protected this family when your grandfather nearly destroyed it. I turned his mistakes into an empire. Everything you have, Ethan, your education, your position, your future, exists because I had the strength to make difficult decisions." Ethan stepped forward, his own anger carefully contained. "You mean you had the cruelty to destroy an innocent woman's life? You framed Maya's grandmother to cover up grandfather's crimes, and then you used that cover-up to take control of the family business." Victoria's laugh held no warmth. Agnes Johnson was nothing. A housekeeper who forgot her place, who thought she had the right to threaten her employers with her self-righteous morality. "I did what was necessary to protect our interests." "Our interests?" Maya spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You destroyed my family. My grandmother died in poverty, branded a thief. My mother struggled her whole life because no one would hire someone with our name. You call that protecting interests?" The confrontation might have continued in this vein, but at that moment, Eleanor Malone entered the library. The family matriarch looked older than ever, but her eyes were clear as she surveyed the scene before her. "It's time," she said simply, and reached into her handbag to withdraw an old leather journal. "Mother, don't," Victoria warned, but Eleanor continued as if she hadn't spoken. "There's something you both need to know." Eleanor addressed Maya and Ethan. about your scars, about that night, about who you really are to each other. She opened the journal, revealing pages of elegant handwriting. Agnes Johnson wasn't just a housekeeper. She was my sister. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Maya felt her knees weaken, and Ethan reached out instinctively to steady her. Eleanor continued, her voice heavy with decades of guilt. We were separated as children during the Depression. Our parents couldn't afford to keep us both. Agnes was adopted by the Johnsons, while I was taken in by a wealthy aunt who later made me her heir. When Agnes applied for a position in my household years later, I recognized her immediately. But I was too proud, too concerned with social position to acknowledge our relationship. That's impossible, Victoria interjected, but the tremor in her voice suggested she'd long suspected this truth. The necklace that started all this? Eleanor pulled it from her pocket, the gems catching the afterno. On light. It belonged to our mother. Agnes recognized it the moment she saw me wearing it. That's why she was in the nursery that night, not just to expose the financial fraud, but to confront me about our shared past. Maya's mind raced as the implications became clear. So, Ethan and I are cousins, Eleanor finished. The scars you both bear, they appeared the moment Agnes touched this necklace that night, as if our mother's spirit was reaching through time to reunite our divided family. Victoria moved suddenly, reaching for the documents on the desk, but Ethan was faster. He gathered the evidence, stepping back to stand beside Maya. Their scars seemed to pulse in unison, a physical manifestation of their newly discovered blood connection. It's over, Mother, Ethan said firmly. We're going public with all of it, the fraud, the false accusation, and the truth about our family's past. You can't stop this anymore. The story broke the next day, sending shockwaves through New York's social and financial circles. Victoria Malone resigned from her position, faced with multiple investigations. Eleanor held a press conference where she publicly acknowledged Agnes as her sister and announced the creation of a foundation in her name to support underprivileged artists. Maya and Ethan found themselves navigating a new kind of relationship, not romantic as they'd once thought might be possible, but something equally profound, family bound not just by blood, but by a shared commitment to truth and justice. Their scars remained as permanent reminders that some wounds can only heal when exposed to light, and that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all, but about finding family in unexpected places and having the courage to fight for what's right. Maya's final exhibition of the year featured a single piece, a massive canvas depicting their family tree, with golden threads connecting all the branches, and at its heart, a simple image of their matching scars. No longer symbols of division, but marks of a truth that could no longer be hidden.